Okay, so welcome everyone who is here. This is the first session of the Well-Defined Book Club. My name is Julie Keller Callaghan, and I am here with my co-founder, Heather Mikesell. We are here to welcome you to our first book club and tell you a little bit about Well-Defined. Before we get started, I wanted to go over a few housekeeping items just to let everybody know how things are going to be going here today. First, I'll tell you a little bit about Well-Defined in our book club. Heather and I started Well-Defined about 2.5 years ago, and our idea is to really be a comprehensive source for all things wellness for the wellness industry. Our readers are professionals and consumers, and I think we've got a really engaged, really mindful audience. And so the idea for our book club came about, Heather and I we've always been book lovers. We've been in several book clubs together, and we just thought it would be a really great way to connect people in the wellness space to talk about all things wellness, dispelling myths, dispelling misinformation, learning about things that sometimes we don't know. We're just really excited to kind of dig deeper. And we've just found in the course of everything we've done with Well-Defined that when people get together, great things happen, great conversations, great networking, and great thoughts. So we're hoping that we do this with our book club, and we're so excited to have you all here. So as I mentioned, I'm going to be recording this, and I will be the tech support on the back end. So if you see me peace out or black out, it's because I'm trying to work something on the back end here. But to get started, we're going to start with an interview with Kerri. While we do that, I'm going to keep everybody on mute. So everybody feel free to grab a tea, grab a glass of wine, grab anything you would do while you were having a regular book club discussion. This is just going to be virtual. If you have any questions, we've gotten quite a few questions that have been sent before the book club started. So we have some questions here, but if you have questions, go ahead and pop them into the chat and we will try to get to them. We're also going to try as much as possible to open this up and make it a discussion, but potentially there's going to be 46 people who are part of this book club. So if you would like to discuss, if you could click on the little reaction button and raise your hand so that I can try it like that, so I can pick on you. And I will do my very best to keep flipping through everything and get to everyone's questions. At the end of the Zoom, for anybody who wants to continue the discussion or really be part of Kerri's movement, we will give her a few minutes to talk about how you can do that. So I think that there are going to be some really compelling conversations that start today. And I think that it will be, there's a lot of opportunity for a lot of people in our space to make a difference. So I think that it would be great if you could, if you're interested in continuing the discussion, we will show you how. And finally, we're going to dive in. Without further ado, I am really, really excited to introduce you to our amazing author. Kerri Kelly is the author of American Detox, The Myth of Wellness and How We Can Truly Heal. I hope you all have your books and had a chance to read them. To tell you a little bit about Kerri, Kerri is, along with being an author, she's a community organizer, a wellness activist. She's recognized across communities for her work to bridge transformational practice with social justice. She's also been teaching yoga for 20 years, and she's known for making waves in the wellness industry by challenging norms, disrupting systems, and mobilizing people to act. Her leadership has inspired Citizen Well, a movement to democratize well-being for all, and is committed to creating the conditions where everyone can thrive. So, Kerri, thank you so much for being here today. We are so very excited to have you. Hold on. Oh, good. I thought I muted you. So now I'm going to turn things over. So welcome. Thank you. And I'm going to turn things over to Heather, and we will go ahead and get started.
Hi, everyone. It's so great to be here, and I'm so excited to talk about this book. It's actually one that I have been marking up left and right in preparation for this conversation. So first of all, I just really wanted to start with getting a little bit of background from you, Kerri. If you could just tell us a little bit how you got started on this journey. I know those of us that read the book have some insights into that, but if you can kind of share what really started this journey to democratize well-being and what was your big awakening?
Well, first of all, thank you, Julie, and thank you, Heather, and thank you everyone for being here. I'll just share, I put this book out on June 7th, and I've been sort of virtually traveling around the country and popping into different book clubs, and it's been the most awesome witnessing to see like the conversation that's emerging from like these little circles. So I just want to name that's like an unexpected thing for me. Like you write a book and then you think it's done, and the conversation has actually emerged from these circles. So I just want to thank you all for being here, because this has like been my favorite part of actually the book writing process. And I'm excited also to hear your questions and your input. Yeah, gosh, my story of how I got here is sordid, and there were many, many, many wake-up calls, much of which I wrote about in the book. And much I feel like much of which I'm still encountering, right? As I live into the question of like, what does it mean to be well in a toxic world? If you read this book, you'll know that like I don't have a lot of answers, but I have like a whole lot of questions. And I'm also looking to a lot of amazing people who are on the front lines of like innovating and disrupting wellness, and who are really showing us and reimagining a different way of being well, especially when wellness isn't the most accessible thing for some folks and for some communities. The book for me begins on 9/11, which is an auspicious day, I know, for so many people. For me, well, at the time, I was aggressively climbing the corporate ladder and checking all of the boxes. I was 25, I was already married, I was living in Manhattan, I had a job in advertising, I had an obsessive working out addiction. And I was like, you know, manifesting all the things that I was told to manifest in my life. If that resonates with anyone, like, it's like, get the good job, get the good husband, you know, get the fit body, make lots of money, buy a house, get a car. Like that life was the one that I was on, and I was very much committed to. And on 9/11, my stepdad was a lieutenant at Ladder 15, based at a firehouse a couple blocks away from Ground Zero, and was one of the first houses to respond. So much so that he actually saw the second plane hit and redirected his men away from Tower 1 into Tower 2, which is where they spent the next 2 hours running in and up 78 flights of stairs. He made it to the floor of impact at 9:58, and at 9:59, the tower came down. And as you can imagine, with that, you know, everything, I thought I knew about everything, y'all. Like everything I had been taught, everything I knew to be safe and to be normal, every idea I had of what was real and true came down with those towers, and that left me really disoriented and lost. You know, my family was in like a desperate state of trying to figure out where my stepdad was at first, and then searching for his body, obviously, and then searching for answers. Like, how could this have happened to us? You know, especially in New York. If there are any New Yorkers on the call, you know, that was a day where we were really shook. We were the city of the invincible. Like no one could touch us, right? And we were floored on that day. And I think just gutted and in so many ways, and vulnerable and deeply human. And so in the aftermath, right, in the wake, not even the wake up, the wake of 9/11, I was desperate for answers. I was desperate for truth. And I was desperate to feel something different. And at the time, I was doing Bikram yoga for all the wrong reasons, to be perfectly clear. It was totally like a masochistic like addiction that I had to sweating in 108 degrees 5 days a week, and, you know, practically vomiting in class. But I like went religiously after 9/11 because it was the only time I actually could feel anything. You know, all of the other times I feel like off my mat, I spent scrambling, escaping my grief, trying to fix everything, you know, trying to take care of my family, trying to make everything right, which was how I was conditioned. And I didn't at the time know what was happening. You know, I didn't have words for what was happening, but there was something about the way that I was able to like feel myself on the mat, even if it was like deep grief and unraveling, that made me want more. And that is the very thing that put me on this path. wellness. I was like, I don't know what's happening to my body, but I want more of this. I want to know what's happening. I want to know, so that sort of got me on this like, one track, if you will, like journey towards like wanting to understand what healing was, what wellness was, what enlightenment was, what transcendence was. And I did the thing where I moved across the country, quit my job, became a yoga teacher, and started to like dig into all of that stuff. And many years later, I was like, hook, line, and sinker, Lululemon pants, mala beads, spouting mantras to anyone who would listen to me. And really feeling, I want to say, like a sense of belonging and a sense of meaning that I hadn't felt before then. Like it was really radical for me. I want to like name that. And I was like super duper into it. I was basically rearranging my life and pulling my poor husband along for the ride to be this sort of like wellnessy person who is into all the things, and just like starving really for more answers and more ritual and more practice. And I have this one memory. I was taking yoga at a yoga studio on Folsom and 4th in San Francisco, which is in a district called the Soma district, south of Market, which at the time was, an up and coming, if you will, area of San Francisco. At night, it was really dark, super crowded with the unhoused. And in the entranceway of the yoga studio, there was like a platform. It was like just a big entrance with a platform, and it was a massive yoga studio, like 200 people would practice in there. It was really like, it was a church. And there was a family or a group of homeless youth that lived in that doorway, in that sort of entrance way, because it was covered and it was warm. And I would pass them every day, y'all. I would walk in to yoga, get my like bliss on, and walk out. And I feel like this happened gradually for me, but over time, and I think the practice did have something to do with this, I started to notice them, like, what is happening here? And then I started to like really look. And then I stopped, and then I was like, wait a minute, like what is wrong with the world if this is the only solution for these folks? And I couldn't quite reconcile why I got to be well, why I got to have this blissed out, transcendent, experience on my mat, when outside the bubble of my like wellness life, so many people were suffering and starving, right? And barely able to survive, much less be well. And that term, like, when you see, you can't unsee, like that was what happened to me. Because if I could have like been like, I didn't see that, and go back into my stupor, that would have been a lot easier for me. So that was like, I call it like sort of like my next wake up call, because that sort of disrupted that kind of stupor that I was in, and it made it really hard for me to keep going in the way that I was going, in the way where I was all about my own individual well-being. I really felt like if I perfected myself, if I became this sort of organic vessel, of compassion, like that would suffice. That was my citizen duty to the world, right? And I realized that in fact was not true. That no amount of personal transformation or individual wellness was actually going to create the kind of systemic and collective change and political change, quite frankly, that was needed, right? To create the conditions where all people can be well. And so anyway, so that put me on a very different path, I want to just name like messy unraveling, and whatever illusions you have about waking up, that like you wake up one day and it's like a light bulb, and then the next day you're like, I understand everything and I know exactly what to do. Like, that's not at all how I understand change. For me, it was very confusing. It was very disorienting. I like didn't know where to go, and I got lost again. And that's when I started to sort of peel back, if you will, the layers, the false promises, and what I call in the book the myths of wellness, which are really the myths of all American dominant culture, right? So like wellness is not like unique, it is just a microcosm within this macrocosm. But I think what makes it the rub around wellness in particular is often that it promises us, right? It's not, it promises us the oneness, or it promises us purity, right? Or it promises us perfection, all of these things that we know to be, it promises us an escape, right? It promises us simple, fast paths to what are deep systemic historical issues, right? And not only is that untrue, it's deep gaslighting, y'all. And it honestly goes to kind of profit these, Sonia Renee Taylor, if you know her book, The Body Is Not an Apology, which is amazing. Add that book to your book club, please. Calls it the shame industrial complex, right? The wellness industrial complex, this massive construction or machine that is profiting, quite frankly, off of our insecurity and our desperation to be well. And so anyway, so this started to inspire me to call a lot of things into question, not as a rejection of wellness, but as a desire for actually what it could be if all of us actually had what we needed to thrive.
I love that. It's so interesting what you said about yoga, especially because I feel like how you talk about it as being like a gateway in some sense. It's like Glennon Doyle talks about this as well. It's how she has this moment on the mat, and it's just where it all kind of comes to a head. And it's kind of what, I don't know if it's just giving yourself this space to kind of process things. And it's the time when your mind kind of shuts down and it can actually focus. We're so caught up in the chatter that, I think sometimes we make wellness about, it's another thing we need to do, but it's also a way, it's also control, when there's so many things outside of our control. Wellness is another way. If I can get my 8 hours of sleep, if I can do this, I can do that, I'm in control and life is okay. Like everything's going to be fine. So
that is what you just said, I think is like fascinating. And that was, when I was sort of unpacking, especially like my conditioned towards dominance and whiteness, white supremacy, control was the thing that I refused to give up, right? When I would do the deep inquiry around why am I where do I when I forget, right, that these things are not healthy or well, right? What is the thing I'm moving towards? And it's always control for me, right? Controlling myself, controlling the outcome, controlling others, right? Controlling other people, right? Which when you look at all of the systems of white supremacy, there are systems of control, right? And so I love that you said that. And I just want to name, I feel like it's both the gateway and the invitation, right? And it's also the distraction, the way in which wellness can be both of those things at the same time. And writing this book was a bit of a mind, am I allowed to curse on here? Okay, I'll just say mind F, because I was both like shaking it, right, and challenging it, but I was yearning for it, right? And when I think about the gift of yoga in my life personally, it was it did sort of lift the veil for me, and the delusion that allowed me to see the hard truth of who we are as a people and a planet, right? But I also know the version of yoga that hooked me and told me not to look. Told me to just focus on myself, right? Told me to mind my business, And so anyway, so I just want to name that paradox because I think that's going to come up a lot in our conversation, this sort of contradiction between well, is it good or is it bad? It's neither. It's just messy, y'all.
Yeah, no, it is extremely messy. And I found that reading the book, I found myself going back and forth and having to reread things because I could have two views on the same thing, just as I was reading. But what I would like to ask you about some of the ideas around being broken and fixed that we need to unlearn, because I know you talk a lot about that. And that was something I found very interesting. There's this whole idea of that we have to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, we have to do that. And I think we were all kind of raised on that notion as Americans, the individualism. And, you think that's a great thing, but then you see the flip side of it where, it leaves us alone. And so if you could just talk a little bit about, being broken and fixed.
Yeah. So in chapter 2, I kind of do a deep dive into that, because I actually think much of the motivation for me of seeking healing coming up, especially like being broken by something like 9/11, and I'm sure we've all had moments of being broken by something, being broken inherently, the pandemic, right? Was that in truth, I really just wanted to fix myself. I was like, I just want to get my shit back together. I want to I just wanted to pull it together. Like my mom would just pull it together, Kerri. And, in researching that chapter, I want to acknowledge and honor the legacy of disability justice activists. I read so many books, y'all, by disabled folks when I was trying to understand, right? Because I'm I have a disability, but I'm a fairly abled person. Most of the time I can move around without needing accommodation. Most of the time I can fit into the structures, right, that society has designed for normative, right, abled bodies. And so I was really curious, what the experience was for bodies that are more marginalized, that actually don't fit into spaces, or that don't, right, that into spaces that are designed only for abled bodies. And so I learned so much from people like Eli Clare and Leah Lakshmi Piepzna, Samara Sinha, and Mia Mingus, and Adrienne Marie Brown, about the history, quite frankly, of normativity and of disposing of bodies that didn't fit into society's idea of what bodies should look like, right? And I'm speaking about disability right now, right? But you could insert gender, you could insert race here, you could insert class, right? You could insert education. There's lots of different social group memberships, right, that get disqualified or excluded or literally disposed of. And I'm thinking particularly, I did a lot of reading into the time of incarceration, where women in particular, right, would be incarcerated for being what they called hysterical or imbecile. Those were the words, right? There was and then eugenics emerged out of that, right? So there's an incredible history, very violent and aggressive history by the medical industrial complex and by dominant culture and by people who were in control, who were in power at that time, which was mostly white men in power in medicine. I'm thinking about the witches who were burned, right? Who decided who got to thrive and have access and be in the world and have autonomy over their body, right? We're seeing that now in the world, around women and reproductive rights, and who would be removed from their family, who would be locked away, who would be experimented on. And I'm being intense because it was one thing to grapple with my own indoctrination into feeling like I needed to perfect myself and fix myself, and that I'm broken, or that I'm not enough to fit into society's ideal. And then to understand that history, I was like, whoa. So I just want to give it up for the folks in disability justice who have been actually at the forefront of this conversation for a really, really long time. Well, way before I even wrote this book and wrote about it. And yeah, I started to then interrogate, right? So much of this book, y'all, is me doing a bunch of history and trying to be where did I learn this? Where did I learn that I'm a thing to be fixed, an object, or that there's an ideal or a normal, right? That has been decided by someone whom I don't know, right? Where did I learn this? And that's when I started to dig into history and systems and socialization. But then I got curious about how am I internalizing these ideas? And I feel like this is the question you're asking, Heather, right? Which is like
Yeah.
all of a sudden, right? Like out of nowhere, you think you're broken and you're like, where did I do that? How did I, right? So this book was about me like being like, how is the air toxic? And then how am I breathing in that toxicity? And how are those ideas, behaviors, right? Patterns, values, almost like lodging themselves in my body, right? And that's how I got to the name detox, quite frankly. So I was like, what is the right? Like, what is the thing that's needed here? It wasn't like wake up your mind. I was like, no, my body is doing a thing. My body is moving towards invitations to be fixed or perfected, right? To be skinnier, to fit more into the ideal. So anyway, so that was like the fixed part. And then you talked a little bit about sort of the impact of toxic individualism, which I'll tell you, one of the most fascinating things that I didn't realize that I sort of unearthed in my research was that, the idea of individualism really emerged out of the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment, right, the time of the Enlightenment really converged, right, with the coming of America, with the birth of our nation. And there's so many of the founding ideas, right, that are built into the Declaration of Independence, that are built into the Constitution that we hear so much about, were inspired and influenced, right, by enlightened thinkers. And so much of that ideology is also deeply baked into wellness. Wellness actually started to emerge. This idea of the pursuit of becoming more well, right, on an individual level, started to actually emerge in Europe at the time, and it came over to the US, decades later. And so I saw this sort of like two tracks of like the wellness, the history of modern wellness, Western wellness, emerging almost in step, right, with the founding of this country, and how so many of those ideas, right, run parallel to one another. And you talked about like the pull yourself up by your bootstraps, like, right, we saw a lot of that over the last couple of years. People literally thinking that they can cure themselves from a global pandemic or a deadly infectious disease. But wellness often tells us that we can become superhuman, right? That we can hack ourselves, life hack ourselves towards perfection.
Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, even it's like you get sold this idea, like if I take the right supplements, I can do this. If I lose my job, it's up to me. I'm going to like fix this. I'm going to like, and that's where the control comes in with the wellness and, all of that. And that's like,
and we get hooked, right, out of a place of vulnerability and fear. And that's where I feel like the gaslighting is, that this is what irks me, right? Is that like when we're in this state of vulnerability, right, that's when those messages get even louder.
Right.
And so this is where it's like an internal game where we need to like be like, hey, is that really true for me? And but we also need to kind of be like, I feel like exposing, right, some of what's happening on the outside and some of those false promises, so that we can hold them with a grain of salt, right? Because it's not to say that like eating healthy isn't going to benefit your body. Like that's probably true, right? Also. So again, like there's no binaries in this conversation, but I do think it would serve us to be curious and to be a little critical of the messages that were being sent, especially by companies that are profiting from them.
Absolutely. Well, one of the things I find really interesting is you talk about us living in a culture that like rewards workaholism, which I think is obvious, relentless ambition, like comparison and competitiveness, and nonstop productivity. How do we change something that's so ingrained in our culture? I mean, it's one of those things like, you think, even if you recognize it's bad, it's one thing if I lived in Sweden and we had a different, sense of, lifestyle and prioritizing things. But when you live in a country where everyone is doing that, everyone's burning the midnight oil, and you feel like you need to be on all the time, like, how do you fight against that? Is it slowly, or do you kind of see this new quiet quitting as like a form of that? Like it's like a sign of protest in some sense.
I just read an article, by the way, the other day about how quiet quitting is actually a libertarian concept. So I'm like confused about how to even use that term anymore. And
it's
actually,
a term anyway, because it's
such a strange term. Yeah. But like quiet quitting is speaking to the trend of people refusing to be exploited. Like that's literally what's happening. People are like, no, I'm not gonna work 50 hours a week for no pay, or I'm not, right, like that. And I think the reason I'm challenging that term is because now when I didn't think anything of it until I read this article, but now I'm like, oh, it sort of puts blame on the individual, right? When it's actually the system and the conditions that are creating this place where people literally can't get through the workday, or are saying, you know what, I'm not doing this anymore. I'm not going to hustle 12 hours a day. I'm not going to work on the weekends. I'm not for nothing, or for no, and so on and so forth. Well, I mean, you're asking the deepest question, and I literally posted something on my Instagram.
And I don't expect I expect it's.
Thank you for asking the hardest question of all time, Heather. Thank you so much. Yes. I mean, I'm trying to think about how not to duck this. I mean, I asked a question on my Instagram literally 2 days ago that asked, it was a tweet by someone else, and it asked, can you be well in capitalism? Is wellness possible in a capitalist system or culture? And there is a pretty righteous debate actually on my feed, which I just sort of let blossom, which is always fun to see like where people are in this conversation. And I think it's really tricky, right? Because in this stage of capitalism, late stage capitalism, or you could, in a capitalist structure and culture where 1% of the population has more wealth than the bottom 60%, just to be clear about like the version of capitalism that I'm talking about. I'm talking about extreme and egregious inequality. That is actually deeply unsustainable. Like we won't survive this version of inequality as it stands. I don't know.
Yeah.
So that's the answer to your first question. I don't know actually I don't know how to get off the hamster wheel. I've been asking this question to a bunch of my coaches because, I just wrote this book that basically was like F capitalism and everything else that comes along with it, right? And yet, like, I need to pay my rent. I live in Los Angeles, right? Like I'm hosting a retreat. Like I'm also participating in capitalism. So I just want to name that paradox that like none of us are pure. Like we can be righteous about it. And yet like whether we like it or not, all of us, unless you're living on an ashram, all of us are sort of situated inside of this. And I just want to name the grossness of that. And how it makes it really hard to divest, to be a fugitive, right? To like push back. Because there are really real survival needs that people have. And that's why you're not going to hear me ever be like, don't buy from this, or don't, it's like, I read something the other day that someone said, even boycotting is a privilege. Not everyone, right, can just like not buy from maybe the only local grocery store that's like in their hometown. I'm thinking about like Albertsons and Kroger is like about to merge, and that's anyway. That's a digress, but so I don't know, right? I don't know how to reconcile that. And I actually think there are some incredible examples of people doing something different inside of that system. I'm thinking in particular about cooperative models, like incredible workers cooperative. I'm thinking about how like workers unions are having like a renaissance right now, and people are getting organized, right? So that they can have enough power and capacity to get what they need from like the corporate, corporate power. So I do think that there's some really cool things emerging, even in that are going to be disruptive, right? To the version of capitalism that is a zero-sum game. By zero-sum, I mean for some people to win, other people need to lose, right? That's deeply rooted in scarcity, right? Which we've all internalized on like a spiritual level and a material level, right? What I'll share with you in terms of like how you asked, like, well, how do we figure that out? I honestly think you need to surround. So this is like the question I've been living into for the last couple of weeks, right? I think you need to surround yourself by other people who are trying to do it. So that you don't feel alone, because competition is a really messed up thing. Right, that you named, like comparison and competition, actually inspires us to move away from people and not admit that I'm tired, I'm scared, like I'm exploited, like I can't survive. Right? Like we don't admit those things to one another because we're so caught up in comparison and competition that it's not cool, right? To actually have those conversations with each other. And so actually like surrounding yourself in community that's willing to name those things. And that's also like, I'm trying to figure out, I literally had a coaching call with someone last week where I was like, I'm trying to figure out how to be in integrity and pay my bills. I don't actually know the answer to that, but I'm in like a real-time inquiry around like I need to pay rent, right? And I want to do my best to like not uphold or reinforce, right, the myths, right, that keep the system going. I want to build new and different relational models, right? I have a partnership with someone where we have an equity pay model, right? Because we both have different social locations and racial identities. So it's like trying to do different things, but I think more than anything, if you really want to be brave and you want to be like, screw the hustle, I want to slow down, I need a break, you have to surround yourself by people who will validate that for you, who will say, yes, you deserve that. And who will also say, and yes, you deserve. Don't surround yourself by anarchists who are going to tell you to like not pay your rent and not feed yourself. Like that is not helpful, right? Like surround yourself by people who are also in the struggle, who are also like committed to trying to figure out, like, you know, to like challenging, right, the system that has us exhausted and depleted, and that's deeply unjust and unequal, while also trying to figure out how to navigate it. Like everyone is doing both of those things at the same time. And if they don't admit that, they're lying.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think it's one of those things where the more people, I don't know, I think the pandemic might have helped move this along in some sense, with so many people kind of dropping out and creating their own businesses. So you can create a culture of your own. And, you know, slowly as more and more women and men do this, you create the kind of place you want to work in, and the kind of environment
Totally.
that nourishes that kind of thinking, where you can prioritize your family, you can prioritize your friends, you can prioritize time. Time is, you know, we say time is money, which is so sad if you think about it, because at a certain point you want to stop trading in time. Like money is not enough to compensate for your time.
My time is dignity. And that is worth something. And we live in a culture and a politic and a society that does not respect dignity. It does not think dignity is worth of anything. And I'm just thinking about how, you know, one of the things I wrote about in the book is how care work, being a parent, I'm sure some of you are parents, caring for an elder, is actually not even, it's not even included in the GDP. In fact, it's a negative on the GDP, because the GDP would benefit from care, like the kind of caregiving that you pay for. You know what I'm saying? Right? Because that's like a profit driven, right? So I'm just thinking about like how like something as essential and human as care for our children, care for our neighbor during a pandemic, care for our aging parents, right, isn't even respected, validated, included in the most important metric that determines whether or not, you know, we are, you know, worth anything, or, you know. So I think what you're naming is true. And I also just want to acknowledge that the other thing that happened in the pandemic wasn't just that people had more flexibility to discover flexible working or entrepreneurial activities, but we also saw what was happening to essential workers. That essential workers, right, were dying on the front lines, were denied basic care or protection, you know, and PPP. And we also saw what corporations were able to take from the economic, you know, protection plan, and what the, you know, so I'm just like also naming that piece because all of that's happening at the same time, and it's all part of the same system. And some of us do have like the you know, I got to stay home and write my book. I couldn't write my book if there weren't people picking up my garbage, delivering my food. And it's real. Like I wouldn't have been able to do anything, right, without thousands, millions of essential workers who made it possible for me to stay at home.
Right.
I just want to name that point too, right? Because that's a part of this sort of system and this hierarchy that that it's not just making folks who are furthest removed, right, from access and privilege unwell. Actually, now you can see making all of us unwell. More people, especially privileged people, are picking up on how this system is in fact not working for us, and it is not designed for most of us, right? Especially if, you know, I'm just thinking about, it looks like there's like a ton of, you know, women on this conversation, you know, like, how can you like not see that given what's happening politically?
I'm going to jump in here too, because we have, I have a couple questions that came from emails, and I think that this is relevant to where we are in this discussion. Is one of the questions that came in, you know, is one, most of the people who are involved in this are actually in the wellness space, you know, running spas, part of the wellness space. You know, what are some of the challenges that come with reckoning with the privilege of wellness, and how do we address those? Because as you mentioned earlier, so many people here are making a living off of it, you know, and how, you know, what can we do here? You know, how do we do that?
You know, I think, so I want to say that there's like the micro and the macro of this question. And the way that I have thought about it in my own personal practice, but also in our political work, is to think about the barriers. Like what are the barriers to entry? Depending on like what your area or your domain of work is, right? It might be cost, it might be like access, like actual like disability access, right? It might be time, it might be location, right? Like where it is, if you have to drive there, if it's, you know, far away from the center of town, or if there's no public transport. I mean, I think like it's a very worthy inquiry because there's a lot of answers. And I'm not saying y'all are responsible for all of those answers, but I do think if we're committed to leaning into this question, we should actually know what's in the way for people, right? What's in the way of people walking through our door. I know a lot of us are, you know, really curious about inclusion. There are some like hard questions we have to ask if we actually want to be in a conversation about inclusion. So those are some of the things, that's where I would begin, is like actually be in a conversation, be in an inquiry about what is in the way, right? Of everyone or anyone being able to access whatever services you provide. And then the next question is there anything that you can do to alleviate or to remove that barrier? So some of what I'm seeing to address the barrier of cost, for example, is to introduce a sliding scale and to ask people, right? And this is also a teaching, right? To ask people to locate themselves socially when they're deciding which cost to opt into, right? And typically there's the actual cost of the service. There's a cost for someone who might need financial support or someone who is more marginalized, right, from these kinds of wellness services. And there might be a cost that's higher for people who have abundance and excess resources, right? And so, and I think it's a question of like, what does it look like for us to be a part of the redistribution of resources, right? The redistribution of wellness. I think, you know, if you have a physical space, it's, I think thinking about whether disabled folks or even neurodivergent folks would feel welcome or seen is an important question. I also think that like being in, you know, inquiry about the racial composition of your team. If you have some kind of space that offers classes, like who is at the front of the class is a very real thing. If you're like, I don't know why, you know, people of color aren't coming to my classes, and you have all white instructors, that is a very real thing, right? I'll say also like being curious about who makes the decisions about things in the, you know, in the spaces that we move, who is in power, who can decide, right? Whether to give scholarships or discounts, or whether to create sliding scales, whether to invest in accommodation or access or props, whether to do, you know, an anti-racism course, whether to be politically outspoken, despite, you know, the sort of like divisiveness that often emerges when you decide to be political, which by the way, If you're choosing to not be political, you are being political by not being political, right? People know when folks are just trying to be neutral so that they don't ruffle feathers, that they are taking on a particular kind of stance, and those people will not walk through the door. Does that make sense, y'all?
Yes, absolutely.
Being neutral is deeply political. And so anyway, so those are like, I feel like some of the questions I would ask about how we can be a part of democratizing wellness. And I just think you mentioned privilege, and I just want to name that, you know, all of us can be we all have different sites of privilege, right? Privilege comes in many different forms. Privilege, the definition I'm using, y'all, is simply an advantage, right? So some of us have an advantage. We have maybe more proximity to access or services or training or money for training. Or we might literally be like regionally closer to wellness services. You know, I'm thinking about folks who are in rural areas where there's like not as many options. And so I think also like taking responsibility, like just becoming self-aware of like, what are my points of privilege, right? And privilege isn't something that I think people always talk about giving away privilege. First of all, I don't know that you can do that. And I also know that I don't know that people want your privilege either. I think it's more about responsibility, like taking responsibility, right? For the proximity and the access and the agency that you have, and then being really intentional, right? About how you participate in the redistribution of resources or the disruption of harmful spaces or spaces that are replicating, right? The hierarchy in the systems that we know are harming us. That would be the way I would work with privilege.
Sorry, we're about halfway through. I was going to see if anybody has something that they wanted to say or share or ask of Kerri before we move on to some more questions that Heather and I have, or some pre-questions we have. Does anybody have anything they would like to ask or discuss right now while we pause in our Q&A? I think I've got you muted, so if you need to say anything, raise your hand. We're good? Okay. All right. Well, Heather, I'll let you keep going. But yeah, if anybody, like I said, if anybody, just a reminder, if you have any questions, send them in the chat. We have some that we have gotten previously via email, and we're going to keep going. So by all means, if you want to jump in, raise your hand, and we are happy to do it. So I will turn this back over for Heather.
I'm just wondering, going on something you had said, in the book, you mentioned something about safe spaces, how the wellness culture promotes safe spaces and positive vibes only. Can you talk about how that's kind of doing us a disservice? Because I do feel like there's this sense that like, oh, we all have to be positive. It's wellness, right? It's got to be happy all the time. And I thought it was so interesting in the book when you said, no, that's not the case. And these safe spaces aren't actually safe in a way.
Yeah, and I love Samantha put into the chat toxic positivity, which is like a very real thing. Yeah, so I'll actually pull the two apart. You know, the thing about, I mean, safe space is the reason I wrote about it is because like everyone in wellness culture is like, this is a safe space, you know, and I think that I want to say that comes from an intention, right? That you want people to feel safe in your space. I want to like honor that. And we cannot know what is safe for other people. No idea, right? What traumas people are carrying into the room or what their needs are, right? Maybe only if we have, I guess, a long relationship with someone, or we have some agreements, or there's a conversation about like what needs are in this room, could we actually know what is needed and then have a conversation potentially about how to co-create a safer space. But I think this idea that we can guarantee safety is it's not just untrue. I just think it's harmful because you can't. So I think, you know, the question then I would ask is like, what does safer look like? And the only way you will get that answer is if you ask people, what do you need in this space to feel safe or to feel present? You know, and it's funny, like I've been in spaces where, like yoga spaces where people have been like, no cell phones, no cell phones, no cell phones. This person has a cell phone. It is totally freaking me out. And that person was like, I am a doctor. I have a need, or or I am a mother, my child is sick, you know what I mean? Like, and so some of it is like as a facilitator or a space holder, understanding that people have different needs. And some of it is also knowing that there might be conflicting needs in the room. And actually, we're here in a group space and we have to figure out how to navigate that together, right? And that's where, if you have a practice of community agreements and assumptions and sort of building a culture, or even creating a culture where people can raise their hands and say, I have a need, I can't use this chair. It's not, accessible for my body, right? That to me is on the path to a safer space. But I think often we just go, this is a safe space and this is how we're gonna, this is how the space is gonna go down, without actually having a conversation or being in relationship with the people in the room about that. That I think can be really harmful. And I think back to your control point, often that's a way that we're just trying to control the room or control the bodies in the room, right? But it's not necessarily an invitation for people to feel included, to feel like they can show up as their whole selves, to feel like they can show up with whatever they're carrying into the room at that time, or whatever needs they have. So anyway, so we, often work with the word brave. This is, what we're co-creating together is a brave space. And a brave space understands, right, that we all have different needs, and that what is safe to all of us is very different. And that we want this space to be one where people can be vulnerable and people can be their whole selves, but that also means that this is a space that needs to be accountable. We need to be accountable for our actions and our words and so on and so forth. Toxic positivity, I don't think there's anything wrong, y'all, with being positive and being hopeful. I think when that positivity denies someone's very real human experience or suffering, it's really limiting and really harmful, and invalidating. And so I think, and you all know this, letting people be where they are, right? Letting people be their whole selves, asking people what they need, honoring people's experience, and not invalidating it. And toxic positivity, I think at times, is a way to silence people.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right on that. Or I think people use it because they don't want to address what is actually going on in themselves, even if they can just be positive.
And the discomfort. Yeah, exactly what you're saying. Often it brings up, if we're leading a space or in control or have agency or a gatekeeper, it brings up our own discomfort. And so we shut it down, right? And we're like, no. So, and I also wanted to see, I think Lisa Jacobs has,
I was going to say, Sam, I unmuted.
Okay, great.
I had a question, then I'm going to jump to Lisa after that.
Rockin', thanks for tracking.
Yeah, mine wasn't so much a question as it was just when you were saying, when we first started our session, you were saying you could just walk past these people who are unhoused, and eventually you were what am I doing? This is what? That's so against everything I stand for. That sort of, to me, ties into the toxic positivity of well, we're going to yoga and we're not going to look at what's really happening in the world around us, because as long as I'm going to yoga, I'm okay. So
totally.
Yeah, I've encountered people who are well, I don't like to talk about that, or I good vibes only, and I'm okay, but I'm not on a good vibe. That's not I can't come to where you are and have that conversation.
Totally.
And just pretend this is not existing in a different bubble. So I just kudos to both of you and Heather to say it's also people who are toxic like that they don't want to look within themselves too.
Totally. I think that part is really important. And if we, if we're tracking our body, right, and we have some awareness and some practice, because I get triggered all the time, y'all. I put myself in really hot spots. So I get tripped up and and I can feel defensiveness rise up, or discomfort or question or insecurity. And I could either react from that place and shut it down or escape or defend myself, or I could get, I could kind of be, what's happening? Why am I uncomfortable right now? Right. And actually what's needed, right, in this moment for people to get what they need. So I love that you said that. And I just want to name I feel like you're getting at like the crux of the crux, right? Which is this idea, and I think this is a majority of what we're being sold, is this idea that we can be well separate of other people. That like my well-being, like I actually, and I think this feels important if you're like in the wellness service industry. This myth that I can be well if I just do all the things and check all the boxes and close my eyes and not pay attention and live in a bubble and go on all the retreats, that I can actually achieve wellness separate of the suffering and injustice of other people and harm and violence. This is like a theoretical thing. I actually don't think that's possible. And I actually think the last couple of years has revealed to us that that's bullshit. And that we're actually now we're feeling more the impact of the broader system, right? Of the collective suffering, of the collective trauma that's at work. We can't, there's no escape. And so like, I just think that it's just calling us more to like understand that there's an interplay between our individual wellness and between the collective, or what's happening environmentally on the outside.
Totally.
Thank you, Sam, for that.
Lisa, do you want to jump in?
Yes, first of all, thank you so much, Julie and Heather, for hosting this, and also Kerri for your amazing work through this book and prior to. I've been following you for a long time. And I actually did an interview that just came out coincidentally last week about detox, wellness and the toxic nature of it. And I talked about your book coming out in June, and it just landed on the podcast last week. So it's kind of like timing of this is crazy. I don't have so much of a question because, first of all, I ran out of orange highlighter. I had to start a whole nother highlight color because I just consumed this, speaking of consuming. And I love it so much. It made me cry, and it made me I was sitting in a coffee shop, and the guy next to me was like, "What are you reading?" Because I was like, wow. And one of the things that we're talking about right now, kind of at this point in the conversation, I really feel like for me on page 62 and 63 about in seeking healing, about healing justice, you did, talk about it, but I really love how you, focused on the work coming out from, the queer and trans, Black, Indigenous, and that type of work about what healing, the concept of healing justice comes out of this work. And you talk about, what does it say? It remembers that we all come from ancestral medicine, and just, there's so many, these 2 pages to me, this is where I started crying, is healing doesn't require that we return to normal or the before state. And I was diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer, and I've been in this wellness world for a long time. And this journey, when I was talking, reading about healing as the full inclusion and integration of our bodies and lived experience, I mean, this whole paragraph, I was weeping. So thank you. But I also think it's a metaphor for where we are as society right now, and like you said, that it refers to the idea that the system we seek to change outside of our bodies are also carried within our bodies. And I feel like for me, the questions that I've had and why I'm so happy we're having this conversation, and I love courageous conversations. I love that term. And it's given me the kind of a hook or something that I can hang on that question of like, what do we do? It's like feeling like that's a start. So thank you. And so it's really not a question. It's just, thank you.
I'm really grateful, and thank you for sharing your journey with us also. I also fell apart writing that chapter for a bunch of reasons. First of all, I never identified as disabled until I wrote this chapter, and I was working with a disabled editor at the time. And they were like, why won't you admit that you're disabled? And I was like, I'm not disabled enough. And they were like, that's not helpful, actually, right? Because what that says is that, well, first of all, it's super scarcity oriented, but it's still like normalizing and centering the abled experience when we're all on the disabled spectrum. We all have different, abilities. And actually, the more that we can own that and claim that for ourselves, the more we create a culture where all bodies, right, can actually be like, welcome, in fact, and then we can start to create the conditions and the systems that allow people to feel that fully, right? But I also, the other part of that work for me in this, is trauma. And in my own journey around trauma, and I'm talking about like the trauma that's event-based and the trauma that's systemic-based. And then I think there's also like a trauma that's associated with the socialization, the training that we receive around we are broken, around we don't get to be our whole selves, around only some of us are welcome, right? Like we're literally trained to play our assigned roles. And when I was writing this chapter, I was reflecting on all the parts of me that I had rejected and left behind. And how, in fact, if I really wanted to heal, I had to actually go back and pick up the pieces of myself that aren't just the pieces that society rejected. They are the pieces that I rejected, that I said aren't good enough to be seen or felt or heard. And that's when I started to think about wellness as wholeness. I was like, oh, well, maybe, right, healing is actually the path to returning to wholeness, right? Where we get to go back and get ourselves and pick up our pieces. And you said ancestors, so much of my journey of sort of dismantling and deconstructing internalized whiteness has not just been about like exposing the ways in which, I'm addicted to control and dominance. It's also about going to get my ancestors and going to get the medicine, right? That my immigrant, ancestors who came over, right, during the Great Migration left behind in order to assimilate into the All-American Project. And so I just name that because there's this, I feel like I'm thinking about like this visual of being a gatherer. We need to like we need to gather ourselves back up. We need to go back and get our past selves, get our ancestors, right? So that like we have all parts of us as we go into the future. And then you play that out on a collective level too, right? We are not whole when so many members of our community are left behind, are disposed of, are excluded and exploited and oppressed, right? We can't be whole, right? Unless we go and we gather, right? All of the parts of the whole of who we are. Like that is the only way I believe that we can be. And so I just really appreciate what you said, because it's like, to me, that's like a moral compass, right? It's like, oh, like I am not well unless I am all well, like all of me, right? I have to like embrace all parts of me, even the messy parts, the parts that I'm ashamed of. And we, the big we, like are not well unless we go get everyone. We make space for everyone. We create the conditions for everyone to be where they are exactly as they want to. And that's not, I believe, the ideological, orientation of dominant culture.
No, it's actually one of the things
why we're here.
One of the things that you mentioned was like when you talked about the dog whistle, which I thought was so interesting, when you said we can't have community because it reinforces the us versus them when it comes to like, those messages, which I think, the last few years we've been hearing a lot of them. And I thought that was just so interesting because there is this us and them, in everything. I mean, it's like migration, you name it. It's like there's just such fear out there. And it's just, I don't know if people just need to lose themselves by, if as long as I'm not them, then I'm somehow safe. Or if I think this way, then, then somehow it's just fear-based thinking, basically, which is so interesting. Just the fact that you mentioned that, because community, it's so interesting. I moved to in the summers, I moved upstate, which is very different than New York City. And when I first went up there, I was kind of like, oh, these aren't my people, what have you. And then as I got to know people, it's like, oh my God, I feel such a sense of community here. Politically, we aren't really aligned, but we don't really discuss politics. But I found kind people and a sense of community that I don't necessarily feel in New York. And I thought, wow, I get the sense of, why people move out of the city, why people get to know their neighbors, how you need your neighbors. And it provided such a sense of comfort in a way, knowing that, if I'm living in a cabin in the woods by myself for a couple of days, my neighbors come and check on me. Like that sense of community is really, I mean, it's a different sort of wellness when you think about it.
Completely. I mean, that's real wellness, if you ask me, in fact. And, you were talking about fear-based thinking. I just want to reframe that to fear-mongering, because I think there is fear-based thinking, but I actually think so much of that is being manufactured by the news, by the media. And if you read that chapter, this is chapter 7, I went back in history, and that sort of like divide and conquer fear-based narrative has been a strategy in our country, right? Since the construction of race, right? To divide people, right? The people in power, I'm thinking about the Bacon's Rebellion in particular, that the governors, the people in power, the landowners were so threatened by a united workers uprising that included, Black and white and immigrant, like a full cross-racial uprising, workers uprising, that they invented whiteness and started to give the white workers material and marginal benefits, right? So as to divide, right, the power of the collective. And that strategy, right, that strategy was by design, right? And that strategy has lived on, right? Anytime there was progress, right, there was often a maneuver to divide. And we're seeing that so much right now. And so I just say that because I think we should all be interrogating, like, how am I living in fear, right? How am I a part of this sort of us versus, how am I giving into that us versus them zero-sum paradigm mentality? And I think we also need to be like, evaluating, like, who is telling me that bullshit? You know what I mean? And is that really true? And I feel like the relational experiences that we have often across the aisle, like the one that you're describing, often reveals that we're actually not as far apart as we thought we were. That's just the story that we're being fed. That's keeping us stuck. And it's preventing us, in fact, from actually reaching out and having the courageous conversations that Lisa was just talking about, right? It keeps us sort of like, I'm not even going to go there. I'm afraid of what's going to happen. And that rhetoric has been just inflamed. I just want to say there's an amazing book coming out today by Anand Giridharadas called The Persuaders, which is all about Lisa Jacobs. Very good conversations. And it's about deep canvassing, and it's about listening. And it's about how we have to build a capacity and build a muscle to listen. It's not about having, like, I want to say, it's not about polite politics. It's not about that. It's not about like setting down our convictions, or, right? It's about listening to each other. Because often when we listen to each other, what we realize is that we actually have similar needs. We just have a different opinion of how we should get to those needs, right? Many, many people in this country are suffering economically, socially, right? Especially with the erosion of the social safety net, right? Many people across race, right, are really suffering and don't have security, don't have a social safety, don't feel supported, don't feel cared for by the systems that were designed to care for them, right? And some folks are carrying around a story that some people, right, in the community stole that from them, or are taking advantage, when in fact, none of us have those, right? So I just think it's important for us to like pick apart the stories that we're being fed, and the gaslighting, the dog whistle politics, right? That is being kind of seeded and dripped, if you will, in the media, and actually just have conversations with our neighbors in the way that you have.
Yeah.
And be listening for, what do you need? What do you value? What's important to you? And that, to me, is the beginning of a conversation that can help us see the ways in which we're probably more aligned than we are divided.
That's actually comforting. Yeah, that's absolutely true. But I love how you spoke about having that, those courage, like having that with your father, like when you guys had a difference of opinion and like, you know, and then kind of circle back, because I feel like that's one of those things, like with family members, when things get heated, you know, there's a sense of like, you just want to write someone off because you just can't stand to be in a room with them anymore. But I thought that's one of those times when you need those courageous conversations, because like you said, there's probably more in common underlying than you think.
Yeah, and that was such a big lesson. If you haven't read this part of the book, I told a story about how I was visiting my dad. This is my birth father, who I had always admired like my whole life. And then I'm an adult in politics, and I think I was coming from the Republican National Convention where I was doing a pop-up wellness center with Ariana Huffington at the RNC and the DNC. This is in 2012. So this is where I was. And then I went to visit my birth dad right after that. So I was like super politically charged. And, you know, and I realized that my dad was like a very like staunch Tea Partier. And I almost couldn't believe it. I was like, no, this can't be. I was like, this cannot be. I'm going to have to convince you otherwise. You cannot be my father and be, you know, and I freaked out, and we debated for 3 days straight. And then I left and I stopped talking to him for 2 years. And he would call and he would be like, hey, honey, just checking in. Hope you're well. I'm not sure why you're not calling me back, but I hope I didn't do anything, but I just wanted to see if you were okay, you know, all of that. And I was leading a yoga retreat 2 years later, and I forget what I was talking about, but we were meditating, and I asked the group, this is like, be careful what you wish for. I asked the group, you know, what's in the way of love? And I asked them to reflect on that. And then I thought to myself, oh shit, I've got something to do. So I called my dad, and he says to me, he was so happy I called. He cried on the phone. And I didn't honestly have the word. I didn't understand yet why I wasn't calling him. And I didn't really have the words. And I had just gotten divorced. So I was very confused about my relationship. Anyway, that's more information than you need. But he says to me, you know, honey, I see you out there speaking out for your issues, like loud and proud, which I am. If y'all follow me, I'm like extremely loud and potent and bold with my political, you know, views. And he said, and I love you more. And I was like, wow, I really failed this lesson. You know, like, here's my dad, who I was judging as less than and politically incompetent, and how can he be my dad? And he's a terrible person because he's voted, you know, and he was loving me when I couldn't love him. And I was like, I have something to learn from that, about how to be human.
Yeah, that was very touching in the book. I love what he came back with. So
yeah, big teaching.
Does anybody else have any questions?
I see something. What are some of the ways we can have, Julie, is it okay if I read your question? Is this a question from email? What are some of the ways we can have courageous conversations instead of withdrawing from people whose views differ from our own? Ooh. I want to answer this 2 ways. First, I think it's okay to have boundaries. I think it's okay to have boundaries. I think if there are relationships in your life that are nourishing and give you love, that aren't politically aligned, I think you should have boundaries. If you feel harmed or hurt by those, you know, or if they don't have a capacity to be in a conversation, or and you should have open boundaries with them. Like, I don't think we should talk about this. Or I think we should only talk about this under these conditions. Like, I just want to say that I don't think we should fling ourselves at like every person across the aisle that differs in opinion, especially when we're actually navigating friends and family and neighbors and work, you know, coworkers. So I just want to like acknowledge that. Thank you. I think there's a lot of amazing stuff coming out of the folks who are studying deep canvassing, which is really not steeped in persuasion, actually, or like you need to read the facts, or it's actually steeped in listening, and really listening for what people value or what's at stake for people, right? Like, and again, like, I just want to honor that these are hard times for a lot of people in different ways, different and disproportionate ways, just to be clear, based on like where your social location and your identity and so on and so forth. And a lot of people are suffering, and maybe they're suffering from trauma. I mean, like for whatever reason, people are suffering. And so I do think, and I want to acknowledge that people's need, I think we can like agree on this, that systemically, right, most people's needs are not being met, right? Like our social system, I'm thinking about how the failure of healthcare during a global pandemic, despite how wealthy healthcare is, the most expensive healthcare in the world, and yet, right? I'm thinking about a minimum wage that is still $7.25, y'all. It has been that for 4 decades, right? And eroding social security benefit, and so on and so forth. The systems are failing most people, right? Even people with more privilege. And so I think if we actually can build a muscle and a skill around listening for what people need, right, then we can actually probably find inroads around some of the things that are actually missing or that are actually needed. And also, who's to blame for that? Right? Like who's at fault? I don't mean like I don't mean about pointing the finger or scapegoating. I'm talking about like who is in power that is allowing the defunding of education and so on and so forth, right? And so anyway, so I just think like listening for like what's in people's hearts, what people are afraid of, how people are struggling, what people need, how people are being denied basic human needs and dignity from a system, right? Listening for those things is probably a great inroad to a really provocative conversation. And I also just want to say, these conversations should happen over time. You should not sit down at the kitchen table and dig in after Thanksgiving. Like, I just, like, I don't think these are not one-time conversations. These are existential conversations. These are existential questions people have about what they value, about what they care about their family, about their survival. And so I just like would be in the way that y'all like tend to people's wellness over time, right? Like tend to these conversations over time, continue to build trust, right? Like dip your toe in occasionally, keep coming back, right? And if someone causes harm with their words, disrupt them. You know, like just what you just said is actually really hurtful. I don't know if you know that. What you just said is hurtful to people. It disregards someone's existence or their reality or their lived experience. I wish you wouldn't say that out loud.
I have a question I wanted to go. We're kind of pivot a little bit, but we talked a little bit about how so many of us are in the spa industry. One of the things you talked about is cultural appropriation, and how they say imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, but is that really the case in spas and some of the things that spas are doing? By incorporating ancient techniques from other cultures. Can you talk a little bit about that, like burning sage or Palo Santo, or can you talk about that and addressing that in our space?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. I want to like first point to like there's some amazing people who are educating folks in wellness. Susanna Barkataki is a friend of mine doing like amazing, and like just here for the conversation, Melissa Shaw, especially folks I'm thinking in Indigenous and Southeast Asian communities for whom this is their medicine, most of it, mostly, are I would look, so I'm going to weigh in, but I want to just encourage folks to like look to them actually for guidance. You know, one of my friends and teachers, Vivette Jeffries, says, you know, she's an Indigenous, and she speaks about how she has to be given permission to use her medicine. And it just made me like, oh, I never asked permission to use any of these medicines, right? That's like not a Western thing to do. And when you look at the history of colonization and all that came with it, theft, you know, land theft, erasing people's culture, exploiting people's culture, right? A lot of what we're seeing is kind of like an evolved version of them. I just want to say that bravely. And I know there's like a whole conversation about like appreciation and not appropriation. I don't know if that's enough. I don't know if saying like, we're really grateful that we get to have access to someone else's medicine, despite what it took for us to get this, or despite the history of their existence. I actually don't think that suffices. In the same way that I don't think like a land acknowledgement is enough. I think getting educated about like, where did this medicine come from? Whose medicine is it? Are we in relationship with folks like that? You know, with folks for whom it's their medicine, I think is a good question to ask. I think, are we profiting from someone else's medicine? Or is the extraction of that medicine, I'm thinking about Palo Santo in particular, quinoa, like these very like wellnessy products, for whom the harvesting and the mass production of these products have literally like wiped them off the earth and made them really inaccessible for the people for whom it's their medicine. So I just think of like asking hard questions about that is going to give you more to work with, if that makes sense. You know, so it's like not a clear answer. So I want to review. Follow the people who know, for the people for whom it's their medicine, ask, read, pay for their courses, bring trainers in, pay them. Be critical about, this is the capitalist question again, like the way in which you might be profiting off of this medicine. Be curious about the extraction and what it's doing, you know, to the harvest and how it's impacting the people from whom the medicine comes. And then I would say two things about like what to do from there. One is like reckon with your like role and responsibility in working with whatever medicine or service you work with. Like, so people ask me all the time, like, do you still teach yoga? And I'm like, I'm in conflict about it. What did I say? I'm in conflict about it. Not in the same way that I used to. I'm constantly interrogating the way in which I honor those practices if I work with them. I also am in relationship with people from whom those practices come from, who can hold me accountable to whether or not I'm working with that medicine responsibly. It's messy. I've stopped working in studios. I mean, I've done a couple things, and you know, yoga is still a big part of my life, part of my personal practice. Yeah, so messy. And I just want to just name accountability. Accountability isn't about perfection, y'all. Accountability isn't about like doing the perfect thing or getting it right. It's actually about being in relationship with the folks that our actions or our words or our behaviors or our businesses might be impacting, and being curious about the ways in which we can move towards repair or do things differently or not do things because they're really harmful and offensive. And so I just think like, you know, whatever ways in which you can be in relationships of accountability. What I mean by that is like, where like you're asking, like, how are we doing? What should we do differently? You know, how can we be accountable to the integrity and reverence of this medicine? Feels like an important practice, right? If we're working with wellness medicine, that almost always, you know, has, you know, comes from origins in Indigenous and Southeast Asian cultures.
Sam
Julie's
had,
muted.
sorry, I muted myself. Sam had a question.
No, I'm trying to think of the best way to word this. So I really appreciate what you're doing. Like, I really look up to the fact that you have grown so comfortable to like use your voice and really, you have grown through what you've gone through, so to speak. I guess something that I struggle with is twofold. And maybe this is like a redundant question because we're both white people. Like, we probably don't have the answer to this. But how do you avoid? I feel like it's a very thin line. Like,
Totally.
certain white people only will listen to white people. So that's why I appreciate you writing this book. And, like maybe that will tap into somebody who wouldn't have listened to the book if it was written by a person of color or something like that. But how do you not take up space, like by doing what you're doing? And obviously you say, oh, well, listen to so and so who's actually of Asian descent and knows the background, and like obviously that person is, so to speak, more of an authority of it on you as you are, of course. But I guess that's my question. How do you not take up space as a white woman in this world? Like, I want to help people,
Totally.
but I also don't want to overstep my boundary. Or I thought for a long time I knew a lot, and I don't know a lot. Like, I want to make sure that like I can help who I can help while making sure that other people can say what they need to say as well, if that makes any sense.
I want to just acknowledge the question, because I think the fact that you're asking it is the right thing. When I wrote this book, I wanted to write a dissertation. I wanted to write a research paper about how fucked up wellness was. And my editor, who is a trans man, and my other editor was a neurodivergent disabled woman, they were like, you have to locate yourself in this book. And I was like, no. I don't want to center myself, and I don't want to take up space. I was like, no, absolutely not. I know where that goes. And they were like, the only space that you can take up is your space. And I was like, oh shit. And that was the hardest part of this book writing process, because then I had to go back and I had to write my experience right into the book. And so I'll say a couple things. One is that not everyone agrees on the role of white people in the work of in justice work and social justice. Not everyone agrees, meaning there's no right way. And actually, to like say there's a right way is just really like, it's just like one more binary that feeds into white supremacy in the way that it wants to be fed. And so I had to grapple with that. And I have many relationships of accountability with people of color who have asked me to please fucking do my job and go get white people because they do not want to. And what that means is that I have people who will call me if I overstep or if I take up too much space. I have people often calling me because I'm not taking up enough, quite frankly, because I'm doing this like weird, like, oh no, like I do that thing all the time when I'm working across lines of difference, and they're like, stop that. Like stand in your experience because you have it, and like do something. And so I'm really trying to learn. And that's why in this book, I chose to just try to model the messiness of mistake making, the messiness of waking up, the mess, and trying to like figure out like, what is my role? What is my assignment? How do I be in relationship in this work? How do I do this work and be accountable? Like that, those were the questions I was asking while writing this book, and they are still the questions I am asking today. And so, yeah, so I think, I think it's slippery because the white gaze is real. The white experience is always centered. And so I don't think everybody should just read this book, which is why there are both footnotes, endnotes, and a resource section, but I do think that we have a responsibility and we have a job to do, because of the way in which, even though our desire is to dismantle and to call in a different world, we still benefit. And so, and I have done a lot of like don't make a noise, don't do the wrong thing, don't ripple, don't take be small in the room. And my community has said, like, please don't do that. The stakes are too high. Please don't do that. We actually need you to show all the way up now. And so, that I was moving from that place, I moved through a lot of fear. I was terrified writing this book. I was like, oh boy, and I had a lot of people in my life who were like, you should be terrified writing this book. But I was really clear that the stakes are too high to not do the brave thing. And I'm going to make mistakes. I want to just say there are 324 pages in this book. Wait, no. There are 294 pages in this book. And afterwards I was like, oh, there are 294 ways I have made a mistake. Holy crap. Right. And it's like now proof. And so I'm sure there are millions of mistakes in here, and I'm here for the accountability of that, but I was told to grow up and step up. And so I did. Thanks for that question. That's like the real question, Sam.
Okay, I said Lisa has a question, and then Kiana has a question or comment. So I'll start with you, Lisa.
Awesome.
Yes, thank you. So I know we're probably going to get to the end of this soon, and I wanted to just put it out there, being, everything you just said, Kerri, about, kind of taking up space and being, loud and proud and kind of asking those questions. And it's kind of where I put myself in the wellness industry. I've been in it a long time, and I kind of was a little timid about kind of, bringing this topic up in any way other than a conversational. And so I'm curious moving forward, as a kind of a fixture, I guess, in this industry, and a voice, how to get the conversation to be louder and more impactful in the work that we do in the industry, like in the trade part of it, and have these conversations, and also how it informs us in the political world and how to get policies. I don't understand why our industry is not more active in policy, formation and the voice. So I know that's probably a huge question, and there's probably more questions and answers. I do feel that the things that you have, the comments or the work that you have after every chapter is a really great start so I'm going to leave it at that. I want to know how to get this bigger and louder in our industry.
I hear you. I want to say consistency really matters. I've been doing this now for, 12 or 15 years. And I think we've all seen like performative allyship, and also the ways in which social issues, get really popular and everyone's posting a black square on Instagram, and then people go away and they forget and they get caught up in their lives and they turn right. So I just want to acknowledge that that's the political appetite is fickle.
Mm-hmm.
And our endurance and our capacity has been sporadic, quite frankly. And I don't mean this just in wellness, I mean this across the board, but in wellness in particular, we have these distractions that are always giving us an escape at all times. So I think, in fact, we need to be more diligent about being like awake to the world and the impact of the world on our work and on our clients. So I think being consistent really matters, and that might mean that it's going to go slower than you want it to go, but like just keep chipping away at the cliffside. You know what I'm saying? Like just keep eroding, if you will, the machine, wear it down, like that to me is like an organizing tactic. It's not like, blow it to pieces and then walk away and leave off. It's like wear people down, wear the system and the structure and the construct down with consistency, by showing up over and over and over again, by getting more people to be in the conversation. And accountability, right? Like model that accountability isn't cancel culture. It's actually being like, oh shit, I did a thing, or I didn't realize that I was causing harm, right? And maybe repair is possible, maybe something else is needed, but like I just think like all of us modeling that there's a way of being, and it's not being perfect, it's not being pure, right? It's not being like ideological or shaming. It's about like being a community in practice around, you know, questioning everything and really just like inspiring people to want more and to know that they deserve more. People deserve more than what we're being given.
I love that.
And the last thing I'll just say is that the tricky thing about wellness, you know, so I've seen a lot of wellness advocacy be focused just on wellness services, like, you know, getting acupuncture covered by, I used to want to do this. I went through all these phases, by the way, getting acupuncture covered by insurance, or, you know, getting yoga into school, like all of those, getting mindfulness, you know, invested, you know, in the DoD. I think those are all cool, but I think when those initiatives, the uplifting of these sort of like more privileged alternatives are actually not attached to like the deprivation of basic human needs. I write about this in the book where it's like, you should meditate, you know, like I worked with the Fight for 15 campaign, and we would host meditations before all of our actions, when we would do actions. And to tell like a McDonald's fast food worker, mother of 3, working like 3 jobs, that she should meditate more is an absolutely absurd recommendation. And so I just say that because if some of you are political and you want to advocate, I just think we need to marry up, right? Like the need to like level up basic human needs, like a living wage and access to healthcare and housing, with, right, like making some of these alternative, super like effective and important services more accessible to more people. Though both of those things matter, and I just see too much of like the industry trying to, you know, mainstream mindfulness and not giving a shit about the complete lack of mental health resources in our schools, or the defunding of education. I mean, it's just like absurd. You know what I mean? So anyway, so I'm just like, I would encourage folks to think about both of those things at the same time.
Kiana had something as well. I wanted to let her jump in.
Yes, Kiana.
Yes, I'm gonna be quick. I did not want to talk, but I feel like I need to say something. Like, I mean, I'm sitting here looking at him like once again, I'm the only Black person in the room, right? So I'm like, but we got to show up, right? We got to continue to show up and have these courageous conversations. And I too just have sort of more of a comment. So like this book was fascinating to read. Like I read it from beginning. I just finished the last chapter today, and I have to be honest, before I read it, when I saw the title of the book, I was like, and I tried to see who wrote it, and I was like, why is she writing a book like this? Like, she doesn't really know what it's like to be a person of color. You know, she haven't, like, what are her lived experiences? I have to be honest, I had those thoughts, but I still wanted to read it. And I'm so glad I did, because I mean, it was tough. A lot of the things that, of course, I know, a lot of these things that you talk about eugenics and population control, and then the scientific racism, like as I got older, I learned more about those things. And of course it hurts, because it affects, you know, my ancestors and a lot of people that I love, because, you know, we experienced a lot of those things. It wasn't that long ago, but I just want to say too, that I agree with you. Some of the things you talked about in the book, the importance of dealing with the root cause of the issue and trying to go from a me to a we. I think that, you know, it's so important in order for all of us to be able to heal. Like you mentioned, we have to know how do we even get here? And so many times you hear people say, they'll make these comments like, well, you know, they're always trying to bring up the past. Why are we always going back to the past? Well, we kind of have to. We're not trying to live in the past, but how are we going to heal and how we're going to get better? So that's why, again, I think this book is just, it was deep. It was really, really deep. But this is how having these conversations and continuing, like you said, the consistency of having these conversations. And also too, just for me, you know, I believe that representation matters. That's one of the reasons why I go so hard, because so many times I can feel like I'm sticking out like a sore thumb, but I'm like, no, I need to show up. I want to be there because a lot of my family members touch back to the thing that we experience. A lot of them deal with high blood pressure, diabetes, you know, obesity, all of those things. So if I could do anything to help, especially people of color, Black, because, you know, I'll do whatever it is, you know, that, you know, to do my part to make sure and to help in this wellness space. So I don't know. I don't even really, I just felt like I needed to say something. And I'm grateful for this conversation. I look forward to so many more. So thank you, Kerri. And I'm going to go follow you on Instagram too.
Oh, thanks, Deanna. I mean, I just want to thank you for stepping in and speaking and acknowledging you're the only person of color in this circle, which I just want to name puts like a particular burden on you in these kinds of conversations in particular that like you don't need and that you don't have to engage in. And so I do appreciate that you spoke up and thank you for reading my book. You know, when people are like, who did you write this book for? I often say I wrote this book for people like me. And I know that there are a lot more people reading it. And it often makes me uncomfortable when folks are reading it who have a completely different lived experience than me, because, well, I really struggled with how to write about the experiences of other people when I didn't have a lived experience of that. And I struggled with not writing about it at all. I was like, how can I write about, you know what I mean? How can I write this book and not actually name those things? And so anyway, so I really appreciate you saying that. And I appreciate you being in this conversation. And
Thank you.
And yes, your voice in particular and your wisdom are central to this conversation. And no, you don't have to take up that burden. I know you know that, but I'm just thinking about how that burden often probably falls on you. And I'm just appreciating you for that.
Well, I'm happy to be here. Thank you again.
Thanks, Deanna.
Well, I was going to say we're coming toward the end of things, and there was another question in the chat, but I don't know if you want to get to that. But I also want to give Kerri an opportunity for anybody, you know, to talk about what's coming next for you. You know, how can people be involved in this movement? What can we do for those of us who want to take this further than, you know, just this initial conversation? You know, can you tell us a little bit about what's going on with you and what we can do next? Oop. All right. You got muted.
Okay. I do want to answer Heather's question about, or your question about apathy. That was you put that in there, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, you did touch on it a little bit about being involved and such.
I think what I want to say about that is, it's a lot right now, y'all. It is a lot. By design, by the way. Right? Because if they're throwing the kitchen sink at us, it's going to be very difficult for us to organize any kind of like systemic response, right? If every day we're like defending ourselves against another egregious attack. So I just want to acknowledge the allotness. And what's happening in the world right now is landing on and in our bodies in really different ways and disproportionate ways based on where we're located, right, in the hierarchy of bodies. I think what I want to say about, I do think apathy is a trauma response. And I also think it's trained into us to turn away and to be distracted. And my friend calls it the weapons of mass distraction. How like everything around us is pulling our attention away from the very thing that we need to be focused on. And my very hopeful and also like existential thing that I'll say about that is, I think our survival depends on our engaging. I think that our collective survival depends on our capacity to stay awake. That doesn't mean that every day you need to be in the streets marching, y'all. It does not. But it does mean that every day when we, I don't know, I'm sure a lot of us meditate every day, or we do some kind of practice, or we do something every day to take care of ourselves. I think we need to do something every day to also take care of the collective. In the same way, you know, if you drink a green juice, if you take your supplements every day, you know, maybe it's a phone call, maybe it's volunteering, maybe it's hosting a block party leading up to the election. I don't know, it could be any number of things. There's bajillions of experiments, right? Social experiments. But I do think that if all of us, right, are engaged in this practice of wellness, which I'm assuming we are given who's here, we have to be as committed to our collective wellness practice as we are to our personal wellness practice every single day. Sometimes it might be small and subtle, right? Sometimes it might be large and, you know, dramatic. But I think we have to get into a practice and a rhythm and a consistency of, like, you know, when we're reflecting on how we're going to be well that day, that reflection include the well-being of other people, or we're in trouble. And the other thing I'll just say about that is it's actually more fulfilling, you know, and more fun. And it points directly at our own individual well-being. You know, I am more happy and joyful and fulfilled and satisfied and whole in this political stance than I ever was in my individual wellness pursuit. Much more so. And so I just say that because the myth will pull you back. You have to believe that your well-being is only possible if your neighbor is well. If you do not believe that, it's going to be really hard to show up in the way that we need you, and we need you. We need all of you. So yeah, I do lots of things. If you want to like stay in conversation, I put out a newsletter once a week with my organization called Citizen Well. It's a newsletter called Well Read. And I've been doing it for 6 years and it's so exhausting, y'all. But I started doing it because folks were telling me that they want to be engaged, but they're super overwhelmed by the media cycle and they just want to know what they can do. And so I try to round up, like, here's what you need to know. Here are people you should listen to. Here's something you can do this week. So that's Well Read. So I'm going to put that into, I'll put that into the chat so that you, if you want to do that, you can. Although I didn't even, okay, hold on. I have to remember what it is. Well, if you go to my website, actually, you can sign up there. The other thing is we have a book club that we did that's free. It's online, it's on the website, and there's actually a meditation that I made for each chapter. And then there are some questions. So if you want to like layer that in, I'm going to put that into chat too. It's free. And it's learn.American Detox. So I'm also doing this thing called the Unlearning series, which is my, you know, I was like, after that you write a book, you're like, now what do I do with my life? It's a very strange experience. You're like, where's the work now that I've written 96,000 words? And so I've been hosting these unlearning clinics that basically break down each myth. So I did a thing called Perfectionist Anonymous in September, which was really cool. And it's sort of like part embodiment, part inquiry, but it like leads people through sort of a deeper, but also like community and collective inquiry into like some of these myths. This month I'm doing Unlearning Individualism, which is all about the conditioned response that we have to go it alone. Next month, I'm doing Unlearning Dominance, which is all about control, Heather. And then the next month, I'm doing Unlearning Scarcity. And these have been really fun because I'm also in inquiry, right, around like, how do I excavate these shapings and these patterns and these logics in my own body? So it's like, it's just going deeper and sort of starting to pull apart some of what we've learned, some of the ways in which we've been trained so that we can kind of see through those delusions. And I am doing a retreat with my dear friend, Michelle Cassandra Johnson. She's also an author who has written amazing books, Heal in Action, Finding Refuge. She has a book coming out called We Heal in Community. We Heal Together, maybe, next year. And her and I are doing a retreat for the first time. We've never done this before, called Detox and Refuge, which is really just about sort of marrying up both of these concepts. Detox being sort of the interrogation and excavation of what we've inherited and internalized from dominant culture, and refuge being the ways in which we can find home and rest and refuge, right? Within ourselves, within the spaces that we move, within community. So anyway, so it's going to be like a yin yang thing. And it's going to be at this really beautiful place that I've done retreats at in Panama, Cambutal, Panama. So I'll put that also in the chat if that's something that interests you. Her and I do a lot of work around working across lines of difference with an organization called Race and Resilience. We've been doing this for about 6 or 7 years now, and are in a practice in our own relationship about how to show up, you know, in a loving and racialized relationship. That's just real always for us. And so anyway, so it's going to be super fun and juicy. It'll be juicy and fun. Tons of space for rest and rejuvenation. But also I feel like a place for folks to recharge because people are tired. Yeah, unlearning, sorry. And I have that here too. I did try to do this in advance.
That's okay. And I will say, while you're adding to the chat, Lisa Jacobs, who's on the call, is going to do a further conversation with members of the spa and wellness industry in February. So here, let me unmute her. So if you'd like to reach out to Lisa, you can do that too and be part of that conversation. So we will in our spa and wellness industry try and continue this conversation as well. And we will, sorry, Lisa, I'll let you jump in here really quick before I wrap things up.
Oh, no, thank you for mentioning that, Kerri. I think you've been talking to Jessica. And so Jessica Duravage Kitteridge. And so I just got back from Spain. She's going up to Kupala. And so we're just like, so we're going to get on more on the same page. Would love to continue the conversation with you about how we can do a deeper dive into this. And so that would be around February, I think. So
I love it. It's a part 2. That's a great collaborative pairing. Yes. Yeah, thanks for that.
Sure.
And I just want to thank Julie and Heather for just like kicking this off and starting this book club. I have a laundry list of books if you would like me to send them your way. So for your subsequent book clubs, many of them are in the resource section of this book. So let me know if you're taking requests. And to everyone here, I mean, I'm just like super grateful to have been in this conversation. Oh, okay, hold on. I'll get you this link. Yeah, it's just, this is like the part of the process that has been unexpectedly amazing, y'all, because there was a quote I saw the other day where it was like, you put a book out into the world and then it's like a child and you have to let it go and see what it does in the world. And that has been sort of the process with this book, and being in conversation and seeing what's emerging and like the book clubs around the country has made the book more, if that makes sense. More, right? Y'all are like making the conversation. So I just want to thank you for that.
Yeah, well, Kerri, thank you so much. Thank you for writing this book. Thank you for everything that you do. And thank you to everyone who joined us on the book club. We did record this, so we will get this up on our site. Give us a few days and we'll get this up on the site, and we'll share this more with our audience and invite you to revisit and reshare and invite you to, be part of the Well-Defined community. And hopefully we can be making a difference in our industry and beyond. So thank you to everyone. And Kerri, thank you so much.
Yes.
Thanks so much, y'all.